Anybody there? Good morning, good morning, anybody. Turn, please, in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15 is what we're going to be looking at today in a bit. We're talking about God's big story through between Christmas and Easter. We looked at the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1, where God made everything good and then formed humanity and said, that's very good. The good news of God's big story doesn't start with our brokenness and our sin and us messing things up. The good news starts with God saying it's very good. There's good things in the world around us. There's good in the person sitting next to you. There's good in the people all around us. God made creation and said it's very good. That's the starting point for the whole story. And then last week we looked into Genesis chapter 3, where it all went a bit wrong. We were trying to understand the mess that we are in. And you see, for the scriptures, the mess that we're in is humanity's responsibility. We might try and find things that we can blame or try and understand what's gone wrong, but ultimately the brokenness that we see in the world around us, the scriptures argue, is down to humanity and the choices we made. Now, just a couple of things to note before we jump into Genesis chapter 15 from Genesis 2 and 3. God created Adam and Eve in the garden. Yes, it's a story to help us understand why things are the way they are. People can argue about how real it was, whether it's a historical narrative, whether it's a myth, The point is, it tells us why we're in the mess that we're in. But Genesis 2, when God creates Eve, he says, I'm going to make a helper for you. And this is the Hebrew word Ezer or Ezer. Now, this word has been used for generations to fulfill the curse that God put upon humanity, where he said to the woman, you will be subservient to the man, he will rule over you. And people have taken that and gone, oh yes, because look, God said, I'm going to make you a helper. It's a little bit like Adam is the hero of the story and Eve comes along to give him a bit of a hand. Or it's a bit like Adam is the Santa of the story and Eve is just a little helper. She's a little elf that comes along to give him a bit of a hand, because that's what Adam really needs. It's all about the guy. It's been a narrative that has defined humanity for millennia. And the problem is, it doesn't fit with the way that the word Ezer is used in the rest of the Bible. Because do you know who is described as Ezer, this helper, most in the whole of Scripture? The person who is described as the helper, remember, the little elf along the side who's doing a bit to help out, the person described as Ezer through most of Scripture is God. God is Israel's helper. So God is Israel's little elf. That's a bit difficult to understand, isn't it? Because it's not about power dynamics. It's about the fact that we are partnering together with God, and that is extraordinary. The fact that God would choose to partner with us. And Lizzie and I, as we've been married, have tried to work this out. We have different gifts, we've got different skills, and we try and encourage one another in using those different gifts. So let us not get to the point where we're able to claim that this word Ezer means that women are just the nice little elves who come along to help Santa organize Christmas. There's equality, there's mutuality in the Garden of Eden, and that's what God is wanting to do in us and through us. It's not about power dynamics or disempowerment. It's about God creating male and female. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see God creating this male and female as different but mutually supportive. It's this stuff which informs our understanding of marriage, of sex, of gender, of power, of partnership, things that are huge issues in our day. And right here in the beginning of the story, we give us some clues about how God longs for us to unwrap that and how we can begin to process how we unwrap it in our day, in our time, in our own lives. So we started with creation, which was very good. And then we have the fall. Creation, and then you could argue de-creation. So I encouraged us to look at Pete Hughes' book, All Things New, and this is the story or the narrative arc that Pete describes, that we start with creation, which is very good, and then de-creation, where things start to fall apart. And for the next few chapters of Genesis, in this prehistory of Genesis 1 through 11, we see humanity descending more and more into the chaos that comes from humanity choosing to turn away from God and own its own future reality and existence. Even as we turn away from God and we see the spiral of descent, the mess that we're in, we do see a little clue of God's solution in the story of Noah. When Noah builds the ark, this story that carries both judgment but also deliverance. And all of these stories lead us up to a character called Abram. Not Abraham, that comes a little bit later, but we meet him first of all as a guy called Abram. And he and his family have moved from the greatest named city in the world, Ur. I don't know why, maybe nobody liked it, but it's called Ur of the Chaldeans, and they moved there as kind of probably modern day Iran, Iraq, Babylonia, that kind of area, and they move to find a new place to live. They settle in one area because Dad wants to settle there, fine, and then Dad dies, and God appears to Abram and says, I want you to follow me. And so Abram starts this journey. And Abram is this person who gives his yes to God. And here, in the story of Abram, God promises to do things for Abram and through Abram. I'm going to call him Abraham from now on. Is that okay? Because it's really hard to say Abram, but it's really, because I'm so used to saying Abraham. So you can read the story through those 10 and 20 through chapters 10 and 20 of Genesis. He becomes Abraham because of a covenant that God makes with him. And in Genesis 15, God makes a really key covenant. And to understand the story of God, to understand God's big story, you need to understand this word covenant or testament. The word covenant and testament are the same thing. So we have what we describe as the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. And then we have the New Testament or the New Covenant. And that's what we're going to look at today. But to help you understand what covenant means and to give you a little preview of the whole of the big story of God, here's a Bible Project video for us to watch. It's 5 minutes long. Strap in. There's loads of good stuff in here. Enjoy.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who is able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Right, there'll be a test afterwards to make sure you got all of that. It's pretty deep stuff, isn't it? And it's a very good summary, I think, of God's big story through the lens of this big word, covenant. God makes this covenant with Abraham and blesses him and says that from his seed or his descendants, the whole world will be blessed. So we're going to understand a little bit more about this word covenant by reading together Genesis 15. So hopefully you've got that in front of you. So turn in your Bibles, Genesis 15. Here we go. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. So just pause there. The whole concept of this is that God had promised that Abraham would be blessed and that his children would be a blessing, his family would be a blessing. But Abraham and his wife Sarai aren't able to have kids. So it's a bit of a problem. We're like, okay, great, you're going to give me descendants, but I don't actually have a child. So how is that going to work? That's the question that's being asked. The word of the Lord came to him, verse 4, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Pause. Do you see there how faith, trusting in God, is understood by God as a right way to live? Abraham's not painted as a perfect guy by any means in this story. But the fact that Abraham trusted God, put faith in God, meant that God responded to him as if Abraham was righteous. He saw his faith and it was credited to him as righteousness. God decided to have a relationship with Abraham in a way that was different to others around him. Carry on, verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I shall gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and ill-treated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the deep breath. Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, and lots of other ites. This is the word of the Lord, almost. This covenant that God made, the closest thing that we have in our society is a marriage. That when someone gets down on their knee and offers a ring and says, will you marry me? And then on the day of the wedding, the bride and the groom standing and making a commitment to one another. It's the closest thing that we have in our culture to this word covenant. Because when God says to Abraham, bring me a heifer and a goat, you and I are thinking, that's a bit weird. Abraham's going, yes. Because when you were told to bring a heifer and a goat and the different animals that are there called by God to Abraham to bring and then to cut in half and to lay one side out there, sort of dead carcass there. And I mean, that's a lot of work, isn't it? To cut a cow in two and then lie half of it on that side and then the other half of it on that side. And then the same with the goat on this side and that side, and creating what is effectively a corridor of blood between these two animals. You and I think, that's gross. Abraham's thinking, this is like a wedding ceremony. Awesome. Please don't try this at any wedding at St. Philip's. You will not be allowed. It's not part of our culture, but it was very much part of Abraham's culture. It seems strange to us, but it was so familiar to him, because here was all of these animals that had been cut up. The blood had been spilled, because covenants are cut in blood. It means they will not be turned away from. This is meaningful. It's costly to Abraham, because these are part of his wealth, his possessions. And there, in the midst of this moment, God makes a covenant with Abraham. The key verse is verse 17, where God appears to Abraham as this burning pot, this brazier. There's like a flaming torch, and there's kind of smoke coming from it. And the point is this, that Abraham is on one side of the corridor of blood, these animals laid out side by side, and God is on the other side. And God approaches Abraham through this corridor of blood, by virtue of which he is saying, Abraham, I am coming to you. Everything that I have is now yours. The echoes in the marriage ceremony of these words that I said to Lizzie and she said to me when the rings are being exchanged, our version of a sign of a covenant. I give you this ring as a sign of our marriage. With my body, I honor you. All that I am, I give to you. And all that I have, I share with you. Within the love of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I honor you. All that I am, I give to you. All that I have, I share with you. When Lizzie and I first got married, Lizzie lived in London. Lizzie lived a life with friends who were earning lots of money and were very generous with their money. Lizzie was earning less money, but was still very generous with it. And when we got married, we talked about the state of our bank accounts. And all that Lizzie had, she gave to me, the overdraft. And all that I had, I gave to her, which paid off the overdraft. And so we started as equals. But we don't hold it against each other, because everything I had, I brought to Lizzie, and everything that Lizzie had, she brought to me. And the partnership that we have is one another, celebrating each other's strengths, cheering one another on, trying to see God's kingdom come in one another, through one another, trying to help one another fulfill the calling that God has put on your life, just as you are supporting me trying to fulfill God's calling in my life. That's what we try to do. Not brilliant at it, but we try. And that's the closest picture we have to what is going on here in Genesis 15. The essence of a covenant promise is God saying, I'm coming to you. All that I have, I give to you. All that I am, I share with you. And Abraham's saying the same in response to God. But notice that actually, Abraham was asleep. Did you spot that? Like, he's not doing anything. He's cut all that. He's probably exhausted from cutting and trying to heave the cow. Okay, I've done it. It's grace. It's the actions of God towards us. The actions of God towards you. That despite our wrong, despite us wandering away, trying to do things our own way, God reaches out to us. Abraham is blessed in order that he might be a blessing. And his family tree is basically, as I said a couple of weeks ago, the story of the rest of the Old Testament. So from Abraham comes Isaac, who gives birth to Jacob, the father of Joseph, and gives him an amazing Technicolor dream coat. Joseph goes down to Egypt and is able to rescue Jacob's family from this famine, but they end up down in Egypt. Oh, I feel like God said something about that. For about 400 years, I think God said something about that. They stay in Egypt, becoming slaves, and then are delivered by this guy called Moses, who takes them out from Egypt, having seen God do extraordinary things to bring judgment and deliverance in the same way as it happened with Noah, but brought the people of Israel out so that they could worship him and be his family, worshiping God, and gave them the 10 Commandments and various other rules to say, this is how I long for you to be, to demonstrate to the world that I'm the one who set you free from Egypt. And what do? They go, yeah, okay. God brings them to the gates of the promised land, which he's given to them. This is the promised land that I promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and I want you to take it. And they go, it's a bit scary. No, thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. So they go wandering in the desert for 40 years, and we read through the scriptures of what happened in the 40 years, that still God provided for them food and drink and clothes that never wore out. And then the next generation, he said, do you want the promised land? And they're like, yes, let's do it. And so they take the promised land, and through the judges and then the kings, we see people who, for various levels of success, help bring God's rule and reign to this people that he calls his family, the people of Israel. They long for kings, and so God gives them King Saul, who's okay initially, and then not so good later on. And then God brings David, this king who isn't perfect, but does turn to God when things aren't great and tries to ask God to help at the right time in the right ways. And because of that, God says, I'm making a covenant with you and your family. And when we follow that line down, we find Jesus. But that's for future weeks. Eventually, David has a son called Solomon who starts to reign. He does okay initially, not so good later on. And eventually, after he dies, Israel splits into two parts, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. And through the books of Kings and Chronicles, you get all of these different kings who are ruling in Judah and Israel. And what's going on? And I don't fully understand. Here's what's going on. They're worshiping other gods primarily. And every so often you get a good king who comes along and goes, guys, we need to be worshiping the Lord who brought us out of Egypt. Remember, that's what makes us, defines us as a family and as a community, as a nation. And people go, oh yeah, we'll do that for a short while. And then they go back to doing things their own way. Eventually, God is faithful to his promise that if they do not continue to follow him, he will take them into exile and bring a level of judgment to them. And that's what happens. And the prophets are the story of God saying, I really don't want to do this. I really don't want to do this. Will you turn back to me? I love you. I want to be a husband to you. I want to be gracious to you. I want to live in relationship with you. If you carry on doing this, I am going to do something. It's a bit like being a parent with a toddler. Put the knife down. You don't need a spoon. You don't need a knife for this. Put the knife down. If you don't put the knife down, I'll take away your dinner. Put the knife down. I don't know why I started thinking about that as an example. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? Maybe I should have thought of another example. What I do remember is the way that we tried to discipline our children was by using the naughty step. And it worked really well for Daisy, who is a raging extrovert and couldn't bear being away from anyone for more than like 30 seconds. Put her on the naughty step. Immediately you'd hear, I'm sorry. I mean, you got to stay there. You've got to think about what you've done. Lucy was a different kettle of fish. Lucy's more of an introvert and frankly loved the naughty step. So we would put her on the naughty step, and there was one time where we found her asleep on the naughty step. We're thinking, this isn't working as like punishment for doing something that you really shouldn't have done. And we discovered that what Lucy really didn't like was having her toys taken off her. There was one time I remember coming home from work, and the house that we lived in, we were in America at the time, and I drove into the garage, and then there was a little utility room between the garage and the kitchen, and that was the shelf where we put the toys if Lucy had been naughty. I walked in, and I saw every single one of Lucy's toys on the shelf. I was thinking, this has been a bad day. What am I walking into? And I walked into a slightly difficult situation, shall we say. There'd been a standoff developing between Lizzie and Lucy that I was invited to adjudicate. And I talked with Lucy about why all her toys were on the shelf. She was distraught. I was upset with what had happened because she'd obviously not been listening to Lizzie. It was obviously seriously important. I don't even remember what it was now, do you? No. It was very important back then. It was a sign of love that we were trying to help Lucy see how to function. It's a sign of love that we were trying to put Daisy on the naughty step, saying that's not okay. And it was a sign of love that the Father kept saying to the people of Israel, come on, please, don't make me do this. But by continually turning away, continually worshiping other gods, to the point that they were sacrificing their children in the fire to other idols, God was like, that's it. And took his people into exile, into Babylon. And a remnant remained. And there's something really crucial about that word remnant. That God was still calling his people to be faithful to him. And some were still seeking to be faithful. It was God's grace and God's goodness that brought the covenant promise to Abraham. It's God's grace and his goodness that reached out to Abraham in his weakness, in his nothingness, in the depths of his sleep, and said, I'm going to be faithful. And there's a verse that Paul writes in the letter of 2 Timothy. He says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. That is the essence of covenant. If we're faithless, God is still faithful. And we see that through the whole of the story. And one of the prophets, one of the people saying, hey, don't do this. God longs for something more with you. Jeremiah says this in Jeremiah 31, verse 31 to 33. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. But ultimately, the story of the Old Testament leaves you kind of hanging. You get to the end of the Old Testament, and you're like, well, what now? Some of the people have returned from exile. A temple's kind of been built. Worship is kind of happening. But God seems to have departed from his people. What happens now? Well, that's the story for the future weeks in our series. But today, I want to ask you to consider this covenant of love that God made with Abraham. This love that despite a crying child, loving, caring, coming through this corridor of blood, giving of himself to us. and inviting us to give ourselves to him.